In the decades following the end of the Civil War, the United States propels itself into the forefront of industrial nations. The country has been developing a manufacturing economy since the early 19th century. But given the devastating crisis it has just been through, this meteoric rise seems nothing short of miraculous.
If one is looking at the great moments of change in the history of the world, the Industrial Revolution is one of those great moments of change. It's equal in its importance to the future of the world as, say, the Agricultural Revolution of 1,000 years earlier. And we generally think of the age of industrialization as the period after the Civil War.
This is an era, actually, in which U.S. industry explodes. We become the top economic power, along with the Germans and certainly the British. But it is economic power that is undergirding our ambitions.
What causes this economic explosion? No single explanation is sufficient. Rather, it is the convergence of a number of dynamic factors, beginning with the availability of resources and human ingenuity.
Individuals who were critical in the creation of the Industrial Revolution, including many nameless people, workers and inventors and people who were lost to history. But some of the great names of the Industrial Revolution are, first of all, the people who built the railroads.
Although the railroads, of course, had begun well before this, the 1860s, the 1880s, 90s is an era in which you see the birth of a truly national economy. Communications networks through the railroad, transport, it's starting to link the country together.
Without railroads, many of the great industries could not have begun, let alone flourish. They couldn't have gotten the raw materials to the factories, they couldn't have gotten their products to the markets. And so some of the great names of the Industrial Revolution, people like the Vanderbilts and James J. Hill, the great railroad tycoons, the Harrimans and others.
The creation and development of machines and of machine tools enables the United States to start to challenge Britain and to some extent Germany and other parts of Northwest Europe as a serious contender, as in the sort of league of industrial producers.
We talk about some of the great inventors, the inventors of the Bessemer process, for example, and the open hearth steel processing. Going back earlier, the inventor of the cotton gin helped create the first great industry in the South, the textile industry. Thomas Edison, whose inventions made such a huge contribution to the use of electrical power, which became critical to the economy.
By the early 1890s, the U.S. is, in purely volume terms, producing a greater value of industrial goods than France, Germany, and Britain combined.
And then finally, there are the great corporate leaders and financial leaders who were also essential to the Industrial Revolution. J.P. Morgan, the great financier who helped put together some of the great combinations. Andrew Carnegie, who created the first great steel company. John D. Rockefeller, who created the first great oil trust. People were often called robber barons because they accumulated so much wealth and did it so ruthlessly, but people were also great builders.
Controversy surrounds these industrial giants, not only in relation to the great power and wealth they are amassing, but how they are doing it, and at what price.
Carnegie, Rockefeller, the great titans of industry are accumulating enormous fortunes and putting together industrial giants like U.S. Steel, which are capitalized at $1 billion in 1901, for example. So there's tremendous inequality of wealth, tremendous inequality of power in the United States.
Some businessmen attempt to assuage public criticism by supporting public projects.
The great industrialists, principally people like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller Sr., in effect invented a philanthropic foundation, which is an utterly new American creation. What that means is it's an endowment to be expended indefinitely for a wide variety of different and not very carefully prescribed purposes, and that's really the key. The earliest kinds of endowments were for very specific purposes, and the problem with them was that the purpose would go away, but it was a perpetuity, so you were stuck with the endowment. And my favorite example of that, there was an endowment for the succor of weary wagon travelers on the way west in St. Louis. Well, what happened when there were no more wagons going west? So these were people who would improve the quality of life for humankind, and that was the phrase they used. So they set up this very new form to give away money, to be managed by trustees who would be sensitive to new problems as they emerged.
The industrial workforce expands dramatically in the late 19th century as the demand for factory labor grows.
Well, the Industrial Revolution, of course, drew into it hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of American workers, immigrants and natives, who in earlier periods might have been farmers, but who were drawn into cities, drawn into towns, drawn into factories by the economic opportunities that were available to them.
The industrial city was a new kind of creature in terms of the kinds of jobs that were opening up, the kinds of industries that were growing, the massive numbers of relatively unskilled or, in fact, completely unskilled laborers that were required to make the engines of industry work.
Well, one of the reasons that so many newcomers from foreign lands were coming into the United States in the late 19th, early 20th century is that it coincided with a period of rapid industrialization and urbanization in this country.
But why do you go to New York instead of to Buenos Aires or to Rio de Janeiro or to Sydney or any other place in the New World? Well, because the wages are better in New York. Things are measurably more miserable in America than we would like them to be, but nevertheless measurably less miserable than elsewhere in the world. So around the turn of the century, some 55 million people get up from where they are and go somewhere else. About 33 million of them go to the United States. So the United States, uniquely among the industrializing nations, is an immigrant-receiving nation.
In part because of the skills they bring with them, in part because of their old world experience, in part because of the local economies of the cities that they arrive in largest numbers. Different ethnic groups tend to capture different industries, so that Jews and to a less extent Italians in the garment industry in New York are a really good example. Or Poles in meatpacking in Chicago. It's the same kind of thing. Those groups don't exclusively fill every job in a certain industry, but overwhelmingly the industry itself becomes marked ethnically as kind of belonging to that group. And that's where managers and foremen look for replacements. Sometimes they would go out of their way to hire different groups just to keep the labor force segmented. The garment industry is a good example where they went way out of their way to hire Italians and then to seat people so that it was one Italian and then a Yiddish-speaking Jewish immigrant and then another Italian, so that they cut down on communication. It was it was a kind of anti-union device. Keep the labor force more malleable by keeping them divided. But nonetheless, in industry after industry that you can name, each one has a kind of ethnic profile to it that is dominated usually by one or maybe two groups, and it has to do with these forces.
Wages and working conditions are far from ideal.
The industrialization process, in some sense, relies on the capacity of investors, of businessmen, to extract from workers more profits than the workers themselves can earn. Wages are too low for both men and women, except at the most highly skilled level. So the result is that the industrialization process everywhere creates a poor, underprivileged, exploited, if you like, working class who live under very poor conditions, who are almost inevitably malnourished, who have very little leisure time and very little time to think or educate themselves.
The struggle existed on a lot of levels. I mean, it existed at the level of trying to find work, and that often could be difficult. It existed in the workplace itself, where accident rates were high. There was always the threat of layoffs.
For many workers, the most disturbing aspect of the new industrial system is loss of control over their own work. Skilled workers are accustomed to running their own shops.
Classic example is in steel manufacturing. Steel manufacturing required these highly skilled men called puddlers who would take the liquid steel, mix it properly. They had a number of apprentices who would help them out. As the steel processes developed, their jobs were automated. Automated not with computers, but with new machines and new technologies, which allowed their job to be eliminated. So all of a sudden you have these guys who had been, at the top of the heap. They're not there anymore.
By the post-Civil War period, skilled workers, mostly men, could manage to cut their days down to 10 hours for the most part. And they struggled by the 1880s for an 8-hour working day. But the majority of unskilled workers and those working in mines and smelters and mills are working 12-hour days and often 2 shifts. Women's hours begin to shrink just a little bit as workers began to protest, as unions began to form, as everybody began to realize that neither a man nor a woman who worked a 12-hour day would have any time to spend with family.
A second key aspect leading to labor conflict is that in these factories, the control over how work is done shifts to management. When the steel puddler is puddling the steel, he can say to the manager, look, I'm going to do this much steel. And the manager can't say anything because they're in control. Right? They don't have control over it. When you have an industrial process, when you have, say, an assembly line or a more broken down labor process, the manager has the power. And they can determine how fast people work, how much they work. So the pace of work in the Industrial Revolution increases dramatically. People have to work harder. Their wages, as a consequence, start to go down.
With less need for skilled labor, employers often choose to hire women and children for obvious reasons.
Women's labor is cheap labor throughout the industrializing process. It's cheap labor because it's assumed that women do not have to support families and that therefore they can be hired for less. So their wages are usually about 1/3 to 1/2 of a comparable male wage. Now, given that incentive, wherever possible, an employer would look for a female to do whatever the job was. The only power that men have over their wage is to refuse to work with women, because if women are brought into a process, the wage declines. So very quickly, the notion that there are certain kinds of jobs that men can do develops, supported both by employers and by workers who don't want competition from women.
With the new immigration from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, families needed the labor of all members in one way or another. Now, usually a married woman did not go out and earn wages, but in some families it was necessary. More likely, as a daughter got old enough, as with sons, the teenage children would get jobs. The daughter might get a job in a factory.
At least 1.7 million children under the age of 16 are employed in 1900, more than twice the number 30 years earlier.
It's important to remember that the child labor laws that are so much a part of our society today weren't there at this time. And that meant that among these poorer families, the temptation always was to put children to work in whatever way was possible in order to support the family. There was virtually no legislation determining what kind of work children would be allowed to do. They were allowed to work in factories of all sorts. They were allowed to work in mines. They were allowed to work on railroads. Railroads were the most dangerous. That was the single most dangerous occupation in this country. Allowed to work in glass factories, in which they would shuffle back and forth between the glass blowers and what we call the annealing ovens. The air was filled with silica, that is, with microscopic, unseeable bits of glass. They were literally breathing glass as they ran back and forth from glass floor to oven for hours a day in 120-degree temperatures. Something, of course, that's unthinkable, almost unimaginable for us today.
Working men and women attempt to fight back against such conditions by adopting some of the same tactics their employers use.
Throughout the 1830s, 40s, 50s, 60s, both men and women are organizing themselves in some way to speak to the reprehensible conditions under which they're working.
There are repeated efforts by workers to form these national unions of one kind or another. The most famous ones, the Knights of Labor in the 1870s and the 1880s. And they would have momentary successes, sometimes really big successes, but they'd almost always collapse.
The Knights of Labor become the largest labor movement in the United States. They're an interesting organization. They believe that the valuable people in the society were the people who produced something. So they let into their union anyone except for stockbrokers, lawyers, and liquor dealers.
and something like 20% of its members are female, some of them organized as housewives, which is interesting, in support of men who are working, but also in support of their own positions as housewives.
They saw the world in terms of, we're all doing something worthwhile, and we should all cooperate rather than compete. Now, the Knights had a lot of problems, and their organization eventually fell apart.
Not only were they being quashed by capital, in a sense, they weren't recognized by a lot of employers yet at that point, but there were problems within unions themselves in that a lot of workers were excluded. The Knights of Labor was an exception to that, but they didn't have huge staying power either.
It is a pattern that is often repeated. Workers are willing to speak out against exploitation, but they lack the means to sustain organized resistance in the face of corporate power.
Really until the late 1800s, when the first permanent national union organization is formed, which is the American Federation of Labor. It succeeds because it's a national organization of craft unions, because it organizes in the traditional way and it organizes skilled workers. It just does it on a national level.
What that means is that in each different craft, from shoemakers to watch cover engravers to hatters to glaziers to railway engineers to railway brakemen, each of those people form their own trade union to negotiate with employers over wages and working conditions. The local groups of those unions come together to form national unions. Then the national unions come together in a federation to cooperate politically.
The women's unions at last tend to begin around 1900. And the one that always comes to mind and that we tend to celebrate is the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which is founded in 1900 by men, by skilled male cutters and tailors, cloak makers, and which at first dismisses the girls who are working in the garment industry as just that, as girls. You know, what do they know about unionization? But it becomes quite clear within a very few years that those girls not only know a lot, but want to know more about unionization.
The groups that tend to be left out of the mix are the country's newest residents, the immigrants.
That group of people is not touched by this labor movement, by the AFL. The unskilled, the semi-skilled, the new immigrants. There's a few unions. There's the brewery workers who organize German brewery workers in, Wisconsin and Illinois. Very boisterous, effective unions. There's a few others. But for the most part, they're not.
There were also continuing clashes between natives and immigrants, between different immigrant groups. Not only were they fighting employers, they were fighting each other. It's also one of the things that made it harder for workers to gain real power, because they were so divided ethnically and religiously.
In 1903, in Oxnard, California, there is a Mexican farm workers union, and Japanese who try to affiliate and create a American Federation of Labor, AFL unit, and they get smashed by people like Gompers. He's okay with the Mexicans, but he really wants the Japs, not to be included. And to their credit, the Mexicans insist on incorporating the Japanese because they were particularly comradely in their efforts to unionize. So you had these kinds of dynamics going on.
Despite the collective efforts of workers, conditions of employment do not improve. Frustration grows, relations deteriorate.
There are massive conflicts with corporate America. Americans have a tendency to think that there isn't class conflict in the United States, but in fact the United States has a tremendously long history of class conflict.
The working conditions in industry in the late 19th century were in many cases, if perhaps in most cases, truly terrible. And there was in the 1870s and 1880s and into the 1890s a series of strikes and labor actions that were among the most violent in our history and that might accurately almost be called a class war in the United States.
For instance, in 1877, the railroads, employers cut back wages. This led to a massive strike, the first national strike in the United States, the 1877 railway strike. Came about because of a cut in wages. It leads to labor turmoil all over the country because the railroads are kind of the first national industry in a sense that they touch every part of the country.
There's a massive nationwide strike in 1886 for a radical goal of an 8-hour workday. There are a series of huge strikes in the early 1900s that kind of have been lost to memory, a lot of them based in the garment trades, people making clothes, people making textiles to make clothes, which are kind of the leading industries in the nation. There are dramatic strikes against the steel industry, which is the cutting-edge industry in the early 20th century.
The International Ladies Garment Workers' future is made on the basis of a strike which is called and run by young women workers in 1909, 1910. Sometimes it's called the uprising of the 20,000, sometimes of the 30,000. Whatever it is, it's a huge uprising of immigrants, women. The first women's strike, you might say, which draws a kind of national sympathy. After all, these are young women who are working those terrible 12-hour days. They are teenagers, most of them, 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, working 12-hour days and 6-day weeks, having to buy their own sewing machines much of the time, in unsafe conditions. They are a very appealing group of women, and they are tough. They are supported by the men in their families and in their immigrant communities, both Italian and Jewish, but also coming from many other ethnic groups. So the households which support the strike have an investment in women, not only making a little more money, but working fewer hours and being treated like real people.
There's a lot of repression of even not just the radical unions, but more moderate unions as well. The federal government's position is that most kinds of union organizing are illegal. There's an extensive use of the court injunction against strikes and against union action. Employers are very strongly anti-union in the United States.
And they don't hesitate to use any means at hand to crush labor unrest.
The use of a kind of violence that has now almost disappeared from the arsenal of labor weapons. The use of private detective agencies by corporations as sort of private police forces, which used brutal tactics of their own to put down strikes. This was a very violent period in the history of American labor, and it was a result of the rapidity of change in the conditions of workers and the terrible conditions under which many workers were forced to labor.
And so the union movement, while it has its roots in this tremendous transformation that the Industrial Revolution causes in people's work lives, and how they work, and the length of the time of day they work, and so on, in their poverty and their control over their labor, they're not able to counter it effectively, not for many years.
Industrialization in the United States is a story of wrenching social change, it's a story of wrenching political dispute, it's a story of mass strikes, it's a story of great internal turmoil. But the piece that I think we've missed in focusing only on the internal struggle is that this was taking place all over the industrialized world. The massive strikes in the United States have exact parallels in the massive strikes in industrialized sections of Germany, in Britain, in France. And so from the 1890s on through the 1930s, you have a series of attempts to try to reach out beyond the borders of the United States, to figure out what's going on in the rest of the industrialized world, to try to imagine that the rest of the world is kind of a storehouse, a great open warehouse of possible solutions, governmental solutions, private solutions, voluntary solutions, but above all, ones that would involve the public in some way in trying to harness and contain and control and to regulate the new, very raw forms of industrial capitalism that they saw everywhere else.
Workers make very few gains in the late 19th century. The strength of the forces aligned against them is just too daunting. And yet the significance of the economic and social changes that are occurring will leave its imprint on the country for generations to come.
If you look at the period between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the 20th century, I suppose the things that you would have to point to as the greatest changes in American life is, first of all, the extraordinary growth of American industry during this period and the creation of what is truly an industrial society. The tremendous growth of cities and of urban life and the increasing centrality of urban life in American culture, in the American economy, in American politics. The huge waves of immigration from Europe and elsewhere that transformed the character of the American population in these years. Together, those things created a truly new society, a truly new country, not unrelated to the America of prior to the Civil War, but increasingly unrecognizable to people who remembered America as it had been before the Civil War. Not that every place in America changed, but the character of America as a nation changed in these years, perhaps more profoundly than in any other period in our history.
Unfinished Nation is a 52-part American history series. For more information about this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online at www.intelecom.org.